Thank you, Jill. Why don't we start with questions for the two speakers? Gordon?
There are all these ads on television that show that certain dental companies say you can regrow the enamel on your teeth by simply brushing on this special sauce that they give you. Is there any credibility to that?
No, but what is happening is there's a process that the dental researchers call remineralization. And I think I finally figured out what they mean by that. So for instance, when we use our fluoride toothpaste, your saliva is saturated with respect to bioapatite, which is, as I said, quite soluble. Fluorapatite is the least soluble of all the apatites. And so if you introduce a source of fluoride into your saliva, essentially, it will precipitate out. And I assume it's going to precipitate on the pre-existing tooth material. So, well, I think the way I put it to these people, we don't always talk the same way, but I say, so this is why you have to brush twice a day. If it were one of these implants, it would be there and it would stick around. But, we drink various sorts of things, carbonated beverages and so forth, and so we are dissolving a certain amount of that apatite and we need to renew it.
In the back there.
I speak loud enough, I think.
It wasn't done, we won't record.
Sorry. My question is that important. Yes. How about the situation in Flint, Michigan, where we have lead leaching from the lead pipes? Is apatite part of the solution there?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I'm actually working with a group that's very much involved in trying to figure out how to, as quickly as possible, restore these mineral scales. They call them scales. I finally managed to say that without coughing at it. These mineral scales on the inside of the pipe they're what's protecting us from lead poisoning. And so when a source of water is changed, for instance, as was happening in Flint, and when they no longer added the sort of chemicals that would have helped to maintain the mineral scales, and so they were removed, then you end up with raw lead that you have to start out with again. And I think after a year or so, they finally were beginning to get the scales growing again. But what has worked well in a number of places, and I was involved in experiments where this was working out well, was adding phosphate to the water source once the scales had developed to a certain degree, and then create the development of a phosphate mineral. And yes, we're actually seeing a sort of a solid solution of calcium and lead phosphate, so sort of an apatite-like, but not exactly pyromorphite. And that has a low enough, you're playing a solubility game. That is a low enough solubility that if the water began to have an elevated lead concentration, it would precipitate out as that lead apatite.
I've seen variations in magnesium and sodium contents in bones and in enamels. Do we know what the effects of physical properties of the apatite as we substitute magnesium and sodium?
Do you have any knowledge of that?
Do you want, if it's bone, you can take it. I can
okay.
talk about the inorganic.
You can, with magnesium, you can actually depress the ability to create the crystalline apatite. And so a certain amount of magnesium actually makes you end up with an amorphous phase, an amorphous calcium phosphate that also incorporates magnesium. So I think that the body uses magnesium actually as a sort of tweaker also with regard to biological apatite. And those of you who study biological calcium carbonate, I think probably have seen something similar. So it's sort of an interesting business. And you can explain why that is.
In organic apatites, magnesium's just about over the edge of being too small. For years, I looked for iron-bearing apatite. I found one in Germany. We did the structure of that, and you'll see a little iron 2+ in apatite, but magnesium, by the time you go that little extra, it doesn't seem to be incorporated in great amounts. Sodium is basically one of the two charge balancing mechanisms. Sodium for calcium gains us a charge, and silicon for phosphorus. So if we want to put in a trivalent rare earth or uranium and thorium, as I showed in that uranium apatite, we did a study of that, John and I, with one of his students, but we need charge balancing mechanisms. Sodium and silicon are basically the two charge balancing mechanisms. Sodium for calcium and silicon for phosphorus in inorganic apatites.
Over here, pesky Mike. So great talk, Jill. That was fantastic. For the two Johns, Jill, you can chime in too if you'd like. I'm interested in this question. 100 years from now, well, 1 to 200 years from now, where will the agricultural industry get its phosphorus source? And keeping in mind that we're talking about between 10 and 14 billion people.
Been looking into that more deeply than I have, but
Mike, if I knew, I'd be a rich man. I have for some talks a picture of a periodic chart, I think from ACS or somebody, that shows a periodic chart, and at the bottom it says, now build it. And that's what we have to build the earth with. And there's nothing else. And one of my students was talking to his father-in-law, and he said, oh, they'll find something else. Well, there's nothing else other than the periodic chart. At wastewater treatment plants, the operators used to curse this scale that filled the pipes, which turned out to be struvite, a phosphorus mineral, and now they're actually mining it in many wastewater treatment plants. They remove the struvite and use it as fertilizer. Recycling it is one way. Phosphorus isn't all good as well. In Vermont, you cannot apply phosphorus-bearing fertilizers to your lawn because Lake Champlain, we have a horrible problem with blue-green algae. We are supposed to be spending $110 million, according to the feds, to fix it, and a state of 600,000 doesn't have that. So what are we going to use? I don't know. But these are the issues that society is going to face. And the 200 years I put up not as a something of humor, but that's how society has changed. You know, we're talking 4.6 billion. In this tiny bit, we figured out a lot of things, and largely because we've extracted minerals. And we can consume minerals at unprecedented rates. Prior to 1859, it was done with a pick and shovel. And it's something society has to think about, how we're going to do that.
John, if I might add something.
Please.
Mike, you used a number in the time scale, 100 years and what is the prediction? 14 billion?
Well,
in that 100 years, somewhere around there.
10 to 11 or 12, somewhere in there.
Yeah. This is a subject of big debate today, and as geologists and economic geologists in particular, but looking at natural resources and trying to estimate how much we have and how long they will last, the idea of peak phosphorus. When will we achieve that? Some people think it might be sometime very soon in the next decade or so. Others think it might be hundreds of years out, and I think that question is still unanswered.
Yeah, sociologists use the term the inevitable surprise, and they use that relating to aging. We know we're all getting older, and then suddenly we're going to see this huge bolus of old people, and it's going, holy shit, where'd they come from? And it's the exact same thing with resources. We know it's coming, and right now we just consume. We don't do anything about it. But we've got to think about that, and it comes from minerals. And I was so pleased you brought up that 350 gigatons. That's a lot of stuff every year.
So I had a related question. John, you actually showed a graph of phosphorus production with time. It seemed that there was a pretty sharp rise up until about 1980, and then it really kind of flatlined for about a decade and a half. And I was wondering, was that some kind of a crisis in apatite production, or what happened?
I can't find that, and I've looked, and I don't know what caused that. It's still a very high level. And I'll throw out another thing that I was hoping somebody wouldn't ask, so I will ask. If you look at the reduction in the percentage of farmers, there's no inflection point at 1859. And it's a complex thing. Our population is growing exponentially. We're getting more and more efficient. John Deere invented the steel plow. We opened up much of the western U.S. to agrification. So it would take a Larry Finger to figure out all those functions that go together. But yeah, I've always been surprised there's no inflection point there. But I think it's astonishing that we've gone from 90% of the population in agriculture less than 200 years ago to 1.5% today that feed us all. So, and that's why we're here.
How are we doing on time, Peter? Are there any other questions for the speakers? If not, I'd like to come back to what I started with. We don't have time to get into the discussion, but I'm going to send out an email on the MSA listserv, not only to participants, but to the entire society. And I would like to get feedback on that so that we can come up with a list of really nice examples. And I'll just give another one. Obviously, we've just seen a myriad of examples of where this one mineral is of interest and of societal relevance. When I started at Miami as a new professor, I was working with Carl Francis, John and I both were, and he questioned about the change in the crystal chemistry along a solid solution of these rare phosphate minerals, lithiophyllite and tripholite. And they were only of significance to people who studied very enriched pegmatites, and they weren't of great abundance. Today, they are one of the major phases in lithium-ion batteries and have, I don't know what the economic significance of it is, but there's just another example of how a single mineral is so important to us. And I think it'd be very nice to have this resource where a teacher or somebody who's going to talk to an administrator or a funding agency can quickly grab some information that is interesting and engaging to show why we study minerals. And I'll do that through the MSA listserv or MSA Talk.